What?
Swedish paper.
Swedish what?
Swedish paper. No.
Swedish affiliation. So that's and I'm very proud of that. But as you can guess from my accent, I'm not very Swedish by origin. So.
Also not about corrupt Swedish bureaucrats, I'm guessing.
Yeah. So you guessed right. There's not going to be. I think it would be very ambitious to find a lot of corruption into Swedish bureaucrats, but it's probably possible. So anyway, this is an empirical paper on corrupt bureaucrats. First of all, thank you for inviting me here, and thank you for being here still at this stage of the conference. And I'm going to focus basically on electoral accountability and the response of non-elected officials. So intuitively, there is no relationship between the two. Hopefully, by the end of this presentation, I will convince you that actually there is one. So fortunately, I don't need to convince you that corruption is a major obstacle to development. But what I'm going to focus here is that, both in economics and political science, there is this simple idea that democratic institutions such as electoral accountability can attenuate corruption. Okay? This simple idea is much less obvious once you consider that the large majority of public officials is actually non-elected. So either you think that the effect of electoral accountability on corruption is limited to elected officials like politicians, either you think that actually the effect goes beyond and reaches all these 99.9% of public officials that are actually non-elected. Okay? So just think about the sheer size of the public service that is non-elected. Should we think that the effect of electoral accountability stops here, to the 0.1%? Okay? That's what I investigate here. So why would there be a relationship? The idea here, there is no theoretical framework, but actually the idea is pretty widespread, at least in political science, and it's simply that voters judge politicians not only based on what they do, but based on the joint output of politicians and bureaucrats. So based on this, politicians have an incentive to influence bureaucrats' behavior to achieve re-election, right? So the point is, can they do so? Can they actually influence their bureaucrats' behavior? Okay, so there are some possible mechanisms through which that can actually take place. In the paper, I argue that one major source of control of the politicians vis-à-vis the bureaucrats is actually the power to appoint top bureaucrats. Okay, we know that it's hard to fire officials, bureaucrats, but we know that often it's hard to change their financial incentives. But one thing over which politicians often have a strong influence is actually who is the top bureaucrat. Okay, they can promote and demote these top bureaucrats with a certain level of discretionality. So what do we know about bureaucrats' corruption and political accountability? Not much, actually. So we do have some evidence that bureaucrats' corruption can be very substantial. That's evidence from Ukraine. But we don't know anything about the relationship between bureaucrats' corruption and political institutions. What do we know about the relationship between politicians and bureaucrats in general? Okay? Abstracting from bureaucrats' corruption per se. We know something about the relationship with top bureaucrats. For example, there is some recent evidence from India that top bureaucrats matter for economic outcomes. That's actually something we didn't know before. We know that bureaucrats care about promotions and therefore react to promotion incentives. And we know that politicians can manipulate transfers. Okay, so there is some bits and pieces of evidence that politicians can actually influence something that top bureaucrats at least care about. We know much less about low-level bureaucrats, okay, which I argue in the paper are a very important part of the bureaucracy. Why? Because they are the large majority of bureaucrats. And second, and very important, in many countries around the world, top bureaucrats are chosen through internal promotions. So actually, low-level bureaucrats constitute the pool of candidates for future promotions, for future top bureaucrats. So they are the next cohort of leaders within the bureaucracy. Okay? So you can either think that low-level bureaucrats are important per se, because they matter for economic outcomes. We have no evidence of that, but that might well be the case. Or you might think that they matter because among them there are the next top bureaucrats. And we know that the top bureaucrats matter. In a nutshell, what am I going to do? I'm going to look at local governments in Indonesia. I'm going to assemble a rich, completely new data set on bureaucrats' corruptions, promotions, and demotions. And I'm going to exploit the existence of term limits at the local level to identify the effect of re-election incentives on bureaucrats' corruption. So just to give you a preview of the results, when I compare districts where the local politician have re-election incentives to the districts where the politician have no re-election incentives, I find that in the first ones, where the politicians have re-election incentives, bureaucrats' corruption is 38% lower, and the promotions of lower-level bureaucrats is 30% higher, and the same for demotions of top-level bureaucrats. Okay? These two results are basically consistent with this mechanism where re-election incentives modify the incentives of the politicians that we already knew, but the politician reacts by trying to manipulate the incentives of the bureaucrat. Okay, I will come back to this, obviously, in the second part of the presentation. So let me give you one slide about the context. You probably know quite a lot about Indonesia because that's a country that is commonly studied when it comes to corruption, but nonetheless, let me tell you that it's a large country. So we are interested, even if you were interested in Indonesia per se and you didn't care about external validity, I think we should always care about countries that are this big. Okay, it's big like a good chunk of the European Union. It's very decentralized, and that's why I focus on these specific countries. So the level of government that I focus on is the district, which is responsible for most of local public goods, education, health, infrastructure, transportation, and so on. This local government is constituted by only two people. A district head, or call it mayor, because it corresponds to a mayor in relatively large cities, while in rural areas it's more of an aggregation of villages. Okay, so call it district mayor or district head, and a vice district head. Now the district head is subject to term limits, and that's what I'm going to exploit for identification. Below these two people there is an entire bureaucracy on average of 4,000 people. So it's large, it's a lot of people. You know, as I said, the non-elected public officials are 99.9% of public officials here. 5%, about 180, are top bureaucrats. 26% are low-level bureaucrats, and 69% are frontline civil servants. So who are the top bureaucrats? So think about the bureaucracy like the two people, the district head and the vice district head, and below that there is the secretary of the government. Below that there are several divisions or departments. So think about the department for education, the department for health, department for infrastructure, and so on, like up to 20. And below that there are offices, the subunits, and so on. So the head of each of these subunits, the head of each of these departments is a top bureaucrat. Below them, there are a lot of civil servants that work as administrators mainly. We don't know exactly what they do, but they work within the same offices at their direct orders, and this is what I call low-level bureaucrats or administrative bureaucrats. And then there is, of course, a mass of teachers, doctors, nurses, all people that work in the schools, in the hospitals, in the health centers throughout the district. Okay? And those are what I'm going to call frontline civil servants. So the focus of the paper, if you want, is in this middle of the chain of public service delivery that starts with politicians, goes down with the bureaucrats, and reaches frontline civil service providers, which are actually the people that you meet when you send your kid to school or when you go to the health center. Promotions are crucially internal, and that's important because that links the top level bureaucrats, which you might expect to be directly influenced by the politicians, to all this mass of about 1,400 low-level civil servants, which you do not really expect to interact, at least daily, with the district head, but nonetheless might be influenced. Exactly because they know that if a top-level bureaucrat goes down, then one of them is going to go up. So this is not true in all countries around the world, and that's actually something that needs to be taken into account when thinking about the external validity, right? So the identification strategy is very simple. As I said, I exploit the presence of term limits. That means that a district head can be empowered up to 2 mandates. So in the first mandate, he knows that he can be re-elected. He got re-election incentives. Whether or not he chooses to run for re-election, I don't really care. In the second mandate, he cannot be re-elected by law. So what I'm going to do is to focus on districts with politicians elected after 2005, more or less. It can be even a few years afterwards. The treatment is the districts with the politicians at the first mandate with the re-election incentives, and the control is going to be the districts with the politician at the second mandate without re-election incentives. And what I'm going to do is also I'm going to follow them before this election round, where all of them were basically at the first mandate. Obviously, you might think that these two groups might be different along several dimensions. One dimension, even if I were to control perfectly for district level unobservables, you might still be concerned that first mandate politicians differ from second mandate politicians, not only because one has re-election incentives while the other does not, but also because second mandate politicians have been selected twice, right? So they have won elections twice instead of just once. So they might just be more talented, more skilled, or even more corrupt. So what I'm going to do to address this, which is in line with other papers in the literature, is I'm going to collect data on the future election round, and I'm going to identify those among the first mandate politicians who are actually going to win the future elections. So we know that these guys, to the extent that the ability is time invariant, these first mandate politicians who are future winners are perfectly comparable to these second mandate politicians instead. And for experience, you know, I'm going to control for numbers of years in office in a flexible way. So the measure of corruption, which I don't need to explain in here, that corruption is very hard to measure and is subject to various criticisms no matter what kind of measure you get. So what I do here is to assemble a novel data set of more than 2,000 corruption prosecutions. And for each prosecution, I have a description, an entire document. Imagine like just a one-page PDF for a couple of pages. And from there, I extract 3 basic informations: the district where the corruption offense took place, the year in which the corruption offense took place. Mind, not when it got prosecuted, but when it took place. Okay, that could be several years before. And the occupation of the defendant. That will allow me to separate people that are politicians from top-level bureaucrats, lower-level bureaucrats, private agents, or whatever is left. Okay? So I'm going to get the simple measures of the number of corruption offenses in a given district year associated with politicians or associated with civil servants or private agents. Okay? Just to give you some examples of these corruption offenses, here I provide 2. The first one concerns corruption offenses done by politicians. The second one with bureaucrats. So between 2007 and 2012, in the district Buleleng, the district mayor emitted a decree with an illegal tax on mining, plantation, and forestry. They were not supposed to, they had no power to emit such tax. But the most important thing is that they pocketed the entire tax revenue, which is quite stunning. In 2007, the head of the Revenue and Asset Division, which is a kind of relatively top-level bureaucrat in District Sido-Harjo, kept some of the funds he was supposed to distribute to 72 orphanages. I took the most heart-moving example. But the point here is that you shouldn't think about corruption here as very sophisticated frauds. That's actually what I expected when I opened the data, when I started working with them. So I imagined any kind of subtleties, especially because of the excess of movies that I watch myself about financial frauds, but instead many of the corruption offenses were simply intergovernmental transfers moved to the district, and then they are moved to the bank account of the district mayor, or money are moved to the bureaucrat who are supposed to distribute it in various forms, and he just keeps some. So it's pretty simple. One thing that I think is interesting that I would like to show you, if I manage here, is that even according to the few corruption offenses for which I have data on the size of the corruption offense, you can already see that corruption constitutes actually a large share of the value of the project for which the money were stolen. Okay, so for the 200 corruption offenses for which I have data on both the project size and the size of the embezzlement, corruption constitutes about 1/3 of the project size. So corruption can be very substantial here. Of course, it's a subset because this information is not always available. And the second thing that I think is very striking about this data is that while basically the median of corruption embezzlement is about $20,000, what you see when you disaggregate the type of offenses by politician, bureaucrat, and so on, you see that embezzlement by politicians is substantially larger than embezzlement by any other type of agent. Okay, here we have the median of about $100,000 of corruption offense by politicians, while for bureaucrats, no matter whether they are top bureaucrat, low-level bureaucrats, and so on, you do get an embezzlement of about $20,000. Even if the guy is a private agent, it's more or less the same size. So there seems to be a substantial difference between these two types of corruption offenses, okay? Right, so so what I'm going to do is skip a lot of preliminary stuff that you might be interested in too. Please ask me and stop me anytime if you need some clarifications at this stage. But what I'm going to do next is to simply show you some diff estimates of the effect of these re-election incentives on the incidence of corruption by agent, okay? And what I'm going to show you also is a couple of coefficient estimates that show the pre-trends. So here, the first column shows the effect on number of corruption offenses, no matter who is involved, okay? And this simply replicates a fact that we already knew. The re-election incentives are associated with a decrease in overall corruption. That's something that we knew from another paper, a famous paper in the literature. And actually, the magnitude of this effect is quite consistent with what we knew from other contexts. The effect is about 30%, a decrease in about 30%, okay? Which is big, actually. What I discovered here is that this 30% decrease is actually driven almost entirely by a decrease in the corruption of the bureaucrats, okay? I don't find any effect on the corruption of the politicians. I'm not going to claim that there is no effect at all for them. It might be that my measure is not particularly accurate when it comes to their type of corruption, or it might be other things, so that's not a claim I'm going to do. But the important thing is that here there is a decrease of about 38% relative to the mean of the control group in the same period. Okay? So the effect is driven almost entirely by them. There is a weak effect on private agents, which is never significant in most of the specifications. Okay, so this is basically the first result. What I'm going to do next is to try to add some details on this basic finding. And specifically, I'm going to disaggregate this decrease in corruption along the political cycle and across different types of bureaucrats. Okay? So here, what you can see, the blue bar corresponds to the previous result that I showed you, the decrease of 38%, but disaggregated over the election year, first year, second, third, and fourth year after the elections. Okay? What you see is that this effect is strong, is quite homogeneously spread out throughout the political cycle. You might have thought that it was only concentrated in the year before the next elections, but that doesn't seem to be the case. And second feature to look at in this graph is the disaggregation by type of bureaucrat. So the red bar is the top level bureaucrats, these 180 people on average. The admin bureaucrats is these low level bureaucrats which work directly for the top level bureaucrats, and then there are the frontline service providers, teachers, nurses, and so on. So there is an effect on both top level bureaucrats and administrative level bureaucrats. As you can see, the effect is particularly striking for the low level bureaucrats. You see, and again, it's quite homogeneously spread out throughout the first part of the cycle. So that's something that we did not know. So all these people are not elected. So we are looking at the effect of re-election incentives on non-elected civil servants. And actually, you might have thought that the effect stopped at the top level bureaucrats because these are the guys that directly interact potentially with the politician. But these people do not normally interact with the politicians, and yet they do react to the re-election incentives of the politician. Okay. So obviously, I do a wide range of robustness checks that I'm happy to talk about if there is time or if you have some particular concerns. But otherwise, I would like to spend a few minutes. How much time have I got, actually?
4 minutes. 5 minutes.
That's reasonable to spend the rest of the time on the mechanisms. Okay, so that's something I worked a lot in the past year. Just to give you an intuition of the mechanism I'm thinking about, assume that reducing bureaucrats' corruption increases the politicians' re-election chances. Okay? As I said, bureaucrats are in charge of the implementation of development projects or any kind of policy of the politician, so I think it's a reasonable assumption. Bureaucrats care about their career. This is also reasonable, especially in light of some evidence that we have from some other countries. And then think that the politician can observe at least partially the bureaucrats' corruption behavior. Okay? It doesn't need to observe it perfectly, but just at least a little bit. At that point, imagine that the politician can influence the frequency of the promotions. Okay? The politician might even be able to go further and be able to influence who gets promoted. Okay? So the identity of the people promoted. But even if that wasn't the case, even if the politician was in charge of influencing just the timing of these promotions, there would be something here. Okay? So what I argue is that the politician can condition at this point promotions to no corruption, and by increasing promotions can increase the bureaucrat's opportunity cost of corruption. Okay? So you are the bureaucrat. Okay, you can choose to steal or not to steal, whether it's a bribe, extortion, or embezzlement or whatsoever. You know that if you do that, you might decrease your chances to get promoted, okay? And the politician can influence your chances of being promoted simply because this period might promote many more people than in another period, and therefore might change their likelihood. So what I do basically is, at this point, I collect new data on promotions and demotions of all bureaucrats in Indonesia, and I check the effect of re-election incentives on this other outcome. Okay? What I find here, in this graph you can see both the effect on corruption offenses, which is something I showed you more or less before. This was the blue bar of all bureaucrats. and these white bars are the new outcomes, okay? This is both promotions and demotions per bureaucrat. As you can see, there is a stark increase associated with re-election incentives that again are associated with especially the first part of the cycle. So these two results put together are consistent with the incentive mechanism that I outlined before. So what do we do with this, basically with these two results? Now we know that re-election incentives decrease bureaucrats' corruption. I argue that the likely mechanism is based on career incentives. And basically, what do we do with this? In the literature, there seems to be some kind of passive acceptance of the fact that the price of the current electoral system is that we should accept that the fact that politicians steal more in the last term that they can be in office. Because we don't want them to run for office again, because we don't want them to run indefinitely. But at that point, even if they steal, we cannot do much. It's some sort of price to pay for this institutional detail. What I argue here is that perhaps the politicians are stealing, but certainly there seems to be a big role associated for their bureaucrats. And at that point, this is something we can intervene on. We can intervene in the relationship between the politician and the bureaucrats. We can modify the incentives that connect the two. At that point, we can actually, hopefully, attenuate or even eradicate this increase in corruption that is typically associated with the last term in office, okay? Which we know to be large. I'm in time.
Yeah,
that's nice.
You done?
Yeah, that's
Perfect.
good.
Thank you.
Where's the chair? Okay. Just a question. So the data on convictions depends on the judges.
Yeah.
What's the amount of power that a politician has in influencing the judges, given they are also public servants, right?
Yeah, so corruption prosecutions are done by prosecutors, district-level prosecutors. So obviously, at first, the primary concern that you have with this kind of data is whether politicians can manipulate prosecutors' activity. Formally, they cannot, because district prosecutors depend entirely on province-level attorney offices, and not in any way, not in the budget, not in any other formal way on district-level governments. So the promotions, demotions, transfers, wages, and so on of district-level prosecutors depend on the province offices. And the province offices depend entirely on this general attorney office in Jakarta, and therefore is completely disconnected by local politics. Nonetheless, you might wonder whether there is some informal manipulation. So what I did spend a lot of time and effort to do was to see whether there was a substantial concern in this setting. So what I do here is basically to run two kind of checks. So you might think that observed corruption is a function of corruption law enforcement and true corruption. Right? So what I do in the paper is basically to estimate the effect of re-election incentives on observed corruption, and obviously that will correspond to the effect of re-election incentives on true corruption only to the extent that there is no effect of re-election incentives on corruption law enforcement. So this assumption needs to hold, at least more or less. So how do I check for this? Basically, I check for manipulation of prosecutors' activity on the intensive margin and not in the extensive margin. So here I exploit the fact in both cases that I do have both the date of the corruption offense and the date of the corruption prosecution. So it's two dates, okay? As I said, and there is substantial, it takes time to detect and to prosecute an offense. The prosecution can take place during the same year of the offense, but 1 year later, 2 years later, 3 years later, and so on. And there is substantial heterogeneity in this timing to prosecute. So I exploit that by estimating a duration model to see whether the speed of prosecutions differs across offenses that took place in districts where the politician was at the first or second mandate, and I find that that is not the case. Especially, I even look whether that varies across, depending on the proximity to elections, and you see that even when you are under elections, the speed of prosecution doesn't really differ. Okay, that's, I find quite reassuring. And then I do something that maybe takes a little bit more time to explain, which is basically to disaggregate the level of analysis one step further, and instead of running it at the district year level, I run it at the district year, prosecution year level. Okay, so basically I get more or less 6 observations for each previous observation, and that allows me to control for a bunch of additional fixed effects, which are this one, which are the district prosecution year fixed effects that control very flexibly for corruption law enforcement differences across districts and within districts over time, and also allow me to identify all the district year combinations that are associated with 0 prosecutor's activity. So you might think that when the legal capacity of the district is very low or it's virtually absent, that's actually the weakest that you can easily manipulate as a politician. So, but even when I drop all these combinations, that constitutes, I think, almost 2/3 of the district year level. Basically, the effects are still there. So here you see the baseline estimates to about 2,000 observations. Then I re-estimate the model with these additional disaggregations. The observations become like 6 times. And then I drop nearly 2/3 of the sample, which are all these kind of weak, vulnerable combinations of district years, and the effects are still there. And the magnitude is more or less the same relative to the mean, which is somewhere here. Anyway, it's in the paper, and I'm happy to discuss this a lot more after the talk, perhaps.
Okay, so I'll ask my question very impolitely. There's another story which sort of overlaps with yours, but which would, you tell me if it's the same thing I'm thinking about. I don't think it's exactly the same thing, but that's a pure information story, that if you're in the bureaucracy, you're uncertain about the sort of attitudes of the politician towards your corrupt behavior. Now, if there's a new guy that enters office, you will be cautious initially because you want to see, what the attitude will be. So there's a time initially when corruption goes down purely because you're trying to sense what's going on, what's going to be the attitude. And then it picks up if you see that, this guy is not so careful. Now, that could overlap with the career concern thing, but I'm thinking that the lame duck situation is different from just the situation where you get a new politician in place, because you have this behavior already sort of starting off. You know that the guy is not there in office. So this is why you get an effect immediately in the year of the election in itself. Do you think these are the same things, or?
Yeah, these are valid concerns. So I think it's a mechanism that is quite nuanced, but is there, and it's very hard to control for. I do something in the paper, and I put something here in the slides. That's what I called results for fresh blood. You see here. So what I do look at persistence of parties in office. So you might think that so something related to what you're saying is whether the politician belongs to a new party or to the same party as before, okay? And then if the politician is a new politician or not, okay? So what I do here is basically to control for the persistence of the same party in power. So you might think that as a bureaucrat, the shock of having a new politician is not so big if the politician belongs to the same party as there was before. So the chances that the guy was already part of the machine and somehow you had information or contacts with the same guy, you knew something about the same guy, it's higher, right? And you might think that there is a bit less, well, anyway, you might think there is a bit less of a shock. But the results are robust to when I basically control for party persistence, well, quite flexibly with several fixed effects for that. And then I even try something quite more ambitious, which is to restrict the sample of first mandate politicians to former vice heads. So these are people that even before stepping into power were already in the same government as vice. Okay? Obviously, I lose a lot, but there seems to be an effect even when I restrict attention to these guys. What happens is that the bureaucrat already knows the vice. It was already in power. It was simply not subject to term limits, right? And the effect is still there. Obviously, the precision of the estimates goes away by a long way, and you get a lot of noise. But there seems to be something even there. That's basically as much as I can do in that respect.
Do we have other questions? We're running way over time, but that's your fault for coming late this morning. Okay, no, so in that case, thanks a lot.